realizing something else. This is just tinkling at me way more than I wanted it to. Now that we're looking at the genetics and the full genomic sequence of it, we're finding it has an entirely different thing going on. Which is one of the amazing and beautiful things that we've talked about frequently here, that's going on with the advent of ancient DNA and the ability to test all of these things differently and the ability to get more information on what's going on, right? And so what this article is talking about, and what this series of articles is talking about, is that at one point we had distinguished or thought that the European cultures had pretty much been the same genetic lineages lineages in the spaces that they're in since they had left Africa. When we had known that the last leaving of Africa is 50,000 years ago, and we had known that it was from the Levant area. We had had some of this understanding, but not a whole lot. And when they're looking at this, what they're seeing is that it's pretty much almost a whole replacement in cultures. Before, they had thought that a lot of this replacement or a lot of these genetic differences had just had to do, well, all Europeans, I mean, by that thought process, yes, everybody. And they have blue eyes, right? So, we all start in Africa. The first everywhere is Africa by that thought process. And that's absolutely true. That does not mean that, current ethnicity and culture stands to everybody, right? Like that current ethnicity and culture is attributed and shared by everybody, right? So what they're looking at now is that we have the knowledge that the ice age and the way the glacial maximums and minimums have gone caused everybody to move down and out of Europe. And then after it's starting to recede, you're able to move back up. At a glacial maximum, you have more land on sea level. So you're going to have like more ocean side. Lake beds are going to be dried up, like the Mediterranean is going to be gone in some cases. And in cases that it's not gone, there's going to be lots of, what is now underwater that would be seashore at that time, right? And so we've known about all of these things, but we've thought before that as people are being driven down at the last glacial maximum, that they're the same groups of people that are coming up out. And now what we're looking at is that this groups of people that are coming back out are, well, in many cases, they're pulling groups of people from Lower Italy coming back out and pulling groups. Let me pull up my articles to make sure that I have the exact spaces because my geography is jack, right? But in many spaces, they're pulling groups from where we've been talking about before about the starting area, right? So as we look at Homo sapiens migration out of Africa and Homo sapiens interaction out of Africa, what we look at is the Levant area and the lower part of the Mediterranean area. Okay, so this means the northern part of Africa, Egypt, the Dead Sea, Red Sea, like all of this area up into the Levant and into the Arabian Peninsula. This all being this space of habitation for extended periods of time with commingling groups. Commingling groups initially meaning the Neanderthal coming out of Egypt, or not Egypt, coming out of Eurasia during the end of that, during the start of that last ice age, as it's starting to shrink their populations, they're starting to shrink their territories, and so they're moving down. And as Homo sapiens are moving up out, and Neanderthals are moving down, and I'm assuming Denisovians are moving down, though this is so new that we're still trying to trace some of that stuff. So Denisovians, Neanderthals, the species who are in areas whose land is now being covered by, you know, a meter of ice, you know, some places like miles of ice, right? All of those spaces needing to be evacuated, right? And people needing to leave, and they're coming down, they're meeting in the Levant area. This is an area where uh, the lowering of the sea level because of all that water going into the glaciers to form the glaciers means that there's all this rich kind of sea ground, right? And we know that Neanderthals and all of these other species, just like us, eat seafood. They are harvesters of the land. They are very much a part of that local biome, and they're very much taking a part, like any other being, in what is nutritionally valuable for them. And seafood has always been nutritionally valuable for the brain of any predatory species, especially cooked seafood, which Neanderthals were able to do. So we know that groups gathered in Levant for 150,000 years, both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, and are commingling and mixing. Hello. And in that mixing and gathering within the Levant area, the groups are going out. But we've known for a long time that the last group of all of sapien leaving the Levant area was around 50,000 years ago. Now, it needs to be understood when we talk about these things that we're not talking about we're talking about genetics as in family lines, right? And when we're talking about mitochondrial DNA, and when we're talking about why DNA genetics is in family lines, we're not talking about always necessarily this like a replacement of out. Like, so if I am as a female, as somebody who bears a womb, I give two X's to my daughter, an X of mine to my daughters. My X is a combination of my father's mother's X, and that he passed to me, and my mother's X that she takes as the same combination. And she gives that individually to me and my siblings, and I give that individually in this combination, individually, genetic footprint wise, like it's a fingerprint, not footprint, genetic fingerprint wise to each of my children, right? And each of my daughters carries those, and they create almost a new mitochondrial Eve at times. And what happens is, say I have several daughters, but three of them don't have children, and two of them die young, and only one of my daughters actually has her mitochondrial DNA pass on. She becomes the founding mitochondrial DNA. So when we trace mitochondrial DNAs and we trace Y DNAs, what we're tracing is not necessarily an entirely alien DNA to the group, and I don't mean out of planet alien, an entirely alien DNA to the group, but a founding that could trace back anyways. Not always. Several times it is actually a total replacement. When we look at things like why DNA can be traced as a replacement, we see it start in like Turkey with a specific Y DNA maybe, and then we see that Y DNA replace other populations. Neanderthals don't seem to have a Neanderthal Y DNA. It might be that they had one and it went away, like it was like our Y DNA is dissolving. Y is actually a dissolve of X. It's a disintegration of X, anyways. And like ours is disintegrating, theirs was replaced. This doesn't mean males go away or penis possessors go away. This means that people who have an Y gene as a trigger gene are no longer. So, and again, that still means penises and testicles are walking around. But when we're looking at this, it can absolutely mean a full replacement, or it can mean that it's a foundation line. So when we're looking at people coming down, right, because you have this ice age that is coming in, and it is taking all of the arable land, all the live on land. It will be something new with that. Okay, so like with the Neanderthals, The y-DNA that we get from Neanderthals is either more closely associated with uh, sapien DNA after a certain period of time. I think 280,000 years ago is what they've stated that the certain period of time is where Neanderthals y-DNA is replaced by sapien y-DNA. But the y-DNA that they have found in Neanderthals before that replacement is more closely associated with Denisovian. Now, y-DNA is basically used to be an X, and it codes for the switch. And X-DNA can code for the switch. Um, so it's absolutely possible to not have something that we pattern as a Y in our head, like maybe something that instead of being a Y, it looks like an upside down Y, or maybe it looks like half of an X, like a short T or something like that, right? So uh, not having that does not mean that there wasn't the physiological appearance of genitals that we associate with male, because different things can code that instead of it just being the y-DNA that codes it. Again, to anybody out there who's new coming in, my understanding of DNA is still pretty faint. It's codes, and the way it speaks does not syllabic to me, and so it's hard for me. But that's my understanding, is that the way that it is with what the y-DNA does and what the y-DNA actually is. Um, it can be replaced as the chromosome itself, but it's not going to like change the physiology, right? But what we're seeing with these articles is that there is a replacement of genetics after the end of the last ice age. And what we're seeing is that this replacement of genetics, so this is pretty much the Neolithic, or like mid Neolithic, or I guess Midlithic. I'm never good at these. So the Neolithic starts like roughly 10,000 years ago, or ends 10,000 years ago. It's like roughly in there. It's like 10,000 to 6,000. Let me look at the exact dating again, because that's never easy for me. Okay, yeah, start is 10,000. So this is the new Stone Age, basically. There's been a couple new finds that I need to look into a little bit more that talk about there might have been steel actually even within the Stone Age, but I'll go into those more later with this other stuff coming out as well. Not today, but I've got to look at it a little bit deeper, but I'll go into it more later. With this DNA replacement, what we're looking at, well, and it's not just what it is, Ducray, is so a lot of what we've got is from females, but it's also the fact that we've often thought that their y-DNA is so degraded that we just haven't found any of it. We have like 4 samples where we have been able to get y-DNA, and one of them is actually very old. In fact, it's one of our older samples of DNA, and it shows a Denisovian, right? And that one's really interesting. That actually, I think, might be in the article, but it's not all of that article in today's tab about I think I put it in there, yes, the 5,000-year-old signs of extinct human species, but I'm not positive. So, yeah, science, right? When we're looking at this DNA coming up, what we're looking at is it's even talking in this article that like the appearance change is that drastic. What we're looking at is an actual replacement. And I want to correlate this with something that is not being correlated, but I honestly think needs to be correlated. And that's the article that I put on here about violence. And the reason with this is because they're looking at this rise of violence. Um, at the same time, we're seeing these replacements. I think this is the one that I really liked on it. So I think did not do that one, did it? I thought the one with the picture behind me was on there and it's not. I will fix that. Oh, no, it is. Okay, that is it. It's the one that has the Venus on it. Um, what it's talking about in here is really amazing because we've talked before that we're seeing a shift around 6,000 years ago of lighter skinned individuals in Northwest Eurasia. And what this is talking about is that the genetic data suggests that before the arrival of farmers in Northern Europe around 6,000 BCE, so that's about 8,000 years ago, uh, hunter gatherers in Western Europe had dark skin and light eyes. People in Eastern Europe and Russia, meanwhile, had light skin and dark eyes. Most surprising, the lack of geographic barriers between modern day Germany and Russia, the two groups spent millennia not mingling. From 14,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago, they did not mix at all. Then they seem to show mixing locally and then a replacement. So at the same time, if we're looking at violence and the start of the rise of evidence of violence in more numbers. So there are things in the archaeological record that we've talked about beforehand that show evidence of violence, though very few of them are very clear evidences of, well, I know of maybe two or three that are evidences of violence between different groups of people. And we've talked about all of those of evidence of violence between different groups of people are all post Neanderthal. But some of those evidence of violences between groups of people or two different people are like to be a concrete evidence that it is actually I stabbed you. You need to see something where there is a spear in somebody's thigh, or there is arrow points in the skeleton, right? Or there is a deep knife cut, right? Um, you have to see something that shows actual like human on human interaction of violence first. And then you also have to understand that there are going to be a couple of instances where some of that looks like actual intended violence is not actual intended violence, like hunting accidents or things like that, right? Um, what we're seeing as a total prior to 10,000 years ago, and again, you have to adapt for destruction of skeletal remains. And again, you have to adapt for the knowledge that a lot of violence won't even show up on a skeleton. And you have to adapt for the knowledge that some things that look like violence aren't. Uh, we're seeing like out of 2,000, the numbers that I saw were like 77 possible violent acts. And out of those, 34 were cranial. And at the start of the Neolithic, we see this peak or start to peak and continue to peak as we go on. Um, and that's what the last article on this page is. So what I want to talk about today and want to go into today is what some of this stuff could mean. I like that it's really low. We can kind of hold it as a discussion. Uh, I've put most of what I've got. Let me make sure. No, I did. That one is on there. Um, I did dig a little bit deeper. Some of the articles that I put on there might be hard for you to access. If they are, I apologize. I did try and get actual uh, free sites for every article, but to get the like journal articles, you might have to go do some search on your own off with the free sites just to find something that you can like have the depth for. But I did try and get those as well. When we're looking at these things, I think it's important to again understand that we are looking at groups that are starting in the same space initially. We're looking at family lines moving out. And I think that it might register better for a lot if we start looking at this more as family lines than anything else. A lot of times we want to decide that groups are different races, right? Or entirely different thought processes, right? Uh, but when we're looking at this as ancestry, as family lines, what we see within that is that it loses this idea of being separate, right? Because if you live in the same city that I live in, you and I have different family genetics, but we're still members of the city, right? If you live in the same community that I live in, right? You and I have different genetics. Hello, everybody. But we are still members of the same community, right? So when we start to look at this more as family lines going down and ancestry going down, instead of looking at this as different continents describing us or different phenotypes describing us, right? We see the culture and we see the heritage and we see the ancestry and we see things that are important to most groups of people, as well as seeing that we are all the same group, not homogenized, but species wise, right? That we have many of the same base things, right? The same base need to continue our line, right? Our family, the same base need to nurture each other, to care for each other, the same base need to um, find love and, community. So, and, same base needs for things a little bit more risque or a little bit more wild. But we all have those same base needs, right? And when we can look beyond it and the when we want to look into, well, this group of people is more genetically prone to this, or this group of people is more genetically prone to this, which is true, we fail to see even within that though that it's true because of family line, because of ancestry. If you're more prone to heart problems, it's because your family is more prone to heart problems. Your genetic ancestry is more prone to heart problems. This doesn't mean that broader ethnicities are prone to heart problems. It means that broader genetic groups that have common ancestry are prone to heart problems, right? And when we look at it in that, we can see where that shift of humanity coming up, and as it moves out, these replacements are replacements of groups of people who, um, well, again, are all coming from the same place in the same time. But these new ideas coming in, I think, starts this instead of commingling, which we see before, right? We see that when we see Neanderthals and Homo sapiens living together, Neanderthals, Denisovians, and Homo sapiens living together, right? We see all the different Homo groups living together until we get to sapien being the only one, really. And instead of this commingling and I want to say enveloping, that's the word I wanted, enveloping uh, groups of people or enveloping newcomers into an already there group, or small genetic groups being enveloped into larger genetic groups. What we're seeing is in this replacement, this new idea, uh, to me, almost seems to cause this replacement instead of envelopment, right? Instead of commingling, right? Because if we're looking at before we're seeing this genetic commingling, right? Before we're seeing groups working together to move forward, now we're seeing groups start to live in certain areas with no geographic boundary and yet still not commingle genetically, right? This to me coming along a period associated with the adoption of farming, a period associated with the adoption of ownership. Uh, and now, as our new ability to look at the genetics of people, also a period associated with a shift to how men and women are actually seen in the archaeological record, right? As we're seeing this move forward, it seems to move along the same lines to me. And so looking deeper into this, I think it's going to be a really interesting voyage as it comes out more. We are seeing that we're not seeing a replacement of culture, but we are seeing a replacement of genetics, which is interesting. We see some adaptations within culture. And earlier they thought that those adaptations within culture were adaptations that came with the influences of farming. So what they're looking at is that mid-Eurasia comes out and replaces, okay, so there's places in Russia and there's places in Italy. So these two groups are coming out and replacing the they're talking first about pre-gravation and accuration. I can never pronounce any of these words very well. Gravation, and then where's the other one so I can try and pronounce it? No, it's not in that one. But they're talking about these cultures not culturally replacing, not tool replacing, not style replacing, but small parts of these things shifting slightly and a huge genetic shift at the same time. And again, it's Russia or Czech Republic, what is now the Czech Republic. Something else said something about Russia, and I'm not sure where. From Spain to Western Russia. The Czech Republic and Italy are distinct, and these are the groups that are replacing the Spanish and French gravations. Now, again, what we're seeing are hunter-gatherer groups and early farming communities within Western Europe who are dark of skin and light of eyes. Uh, we've talked before about like Lower England's not out from underneath the ice until 27,000 years ago, and the rest of England to include, or the rest of the top of England, I guess Scotland. So the rest to Scotland, the tip of Scotland, and the Scandinavian region and Ireland are not out from underneath the ice until 8,000 years ago. And the earliest finds in Scandinavia are 7,000 years old. So when we're looking at these cultures, we're looking at cultures who, again, earliest finds in Scandinavia are 7,000 years ago. I don't think that we're seeing, I know there's some Poland finds for Neanderthals, but geographically, I don't think Poland is that high up. And again, I'm trying to picture it in my mind, but I'm probably not picturing the best. Um, we're not seeing that out from underneath ice, Scandinavian region out from underneath ice until that time period. I don't think we see any like Neanderthal or anything like that up in the Scandinavian region. I know we don't really see any in Ireland. I do know that we see Neanderthals and Heidelbergensis in England, and that's 6,000 years, 600,000 years old. But our earliest sapien that we see in England, we just pushed that back to 14,000 years ago. The one before that was Cheddarman at 10,000 years ago, and Cheddarman was black skin, dark skin, and blue eyes. And roughly, we pulled up the Cheddarman. It looks curiously like Ragnar Lothbrok with dark skin and blue eyes, uh, but or a reconstruction of it. And that we also know that his direct descendant lives a mile from him, right? So we know that there's not a complete and total replacement of this culture. But we also know that as a whole, we're seeing more, well, not complete replacement of genetics, because that's a direct descendant. We're also seeing that there is more, maybe I would think of it more as a, hmm, I don't know. I really don't know. Because again, we're seeing, if we, okay, so we know that the lighter skinned, darker eyed group coming over from the Middle Eurasian area uh, is coming up. Proto-Aragratian is what they're calling it, the other one. Okay, so if we're looking at them coming up, I want to see where I'm. Sorry, little one, I didn't mean to get you. There's a map that I wanted. Hold on, I wanted to grab a map really quick that is going to show me something. Weird topography. So if I think that what we're looking at is more of a, I don't think it's like, okay, so it talks about replacement, but it also talks about having the different genetics that are carrying on as well. And so if it's talking about different genetics within that is carrying on, but it's also talking about a replacement, my thought process would be that it's getting a so not necessarily like an absolute replacement. Uh if the Neanderthals are such a small group that when we come in, and I'm not saying that the Europeans that were there were a small group, but if the Neanderthals are a small group when I'm coming in, and where the Neanderthals genes are being incorporated into my genes, right? Um, I'm not necessarily replacing the Neanderthal population, but I am also replacing the Neanderthal population as a sapien. And so if we're seeing that, because we've talked before about 6,000 years ago, they see where the shift from darker skin, blue-eyed, is shifting into lighter skin and brown-eyed in Eurasia. We also see at the same time that darker skin and blue-eyed being the group that is there in that settles Scandinavia at this time, along with lighter skin, brown-eyed people coming from the steppes. As well. So what we're looking at is as this last ice age is receding, the groups that are here are receding down, and the groups that are here are receding down. Incorporating, coming in, the groups are going down. So we're going, if you're looking at the groups going pretty much straight down, as the ice is receding and going back up, and the groups are coming up, this group is coming up, but not. I mean, it's coming up and it's there, but this group is coming over more populous and coming into the space. And so you might be seeing side by side, but it can't be completely replacing, even if the article, because we know that there are still people who are direct descendants from that at this point because they've shown that. So I don't know. It's going to be something that we're going to be looking into a little bit more, I'm sure, and getting more. I do know that some of this stuff we talk about within Engazal and within Mesopotamia. When we're looking at Mesopotamia, we talk within, or it talks within the Mesopotamian stuff that they have Proto-Neolithic, what they call the hill people, the barbarians in the hills. And we've talked about this before, the barbarians in the hills attacking Engazal, not Engazal, but ancient Sumer and stuff like that. So the what we call West Asia is going to be, here's a good idea of it. This is a biblical world, and I don't know, you can't really see so much, but you can see that this is the Mediterranean here, kind of. This is the Arabian Peninsula, I think is what we call it, or maybe this is the Arabian Peninsula. Yeah, that's the peninsula. I can't remember what this little thing is called. Have been there. I can't remember what it is. But here's the Nile Delta in Upper Africa, and here's up into the Levant area and the Upper Mediterranean here. So that's where we see that start of like farming and cultures. When we talk about early civilizations in any area, what we're talking about is all in here. So this is over here on the other side, going into, because this big thing here is the Arabian Peninsula. Let me make sure I'm actually showing it over here. Yeah. This here is the Indian Ocean, I think is what it is. but this is the peninsula here. Now, here in they're talking about barbarians from the hills up here, which is going to be that I want to say, and God, I want to say it without looking at a map. Oh, I want to say we're looking at the Caucasus Mountain region and above the Caucasus Mountain region. Those are going to be the barbarians in the hills that are being fought when these cities are starting, and they are starting building walls and keeping armies, right? When the start of violence between each other is starting. And when we're looking at that, they're saying that basically the Europeans are coming down in and attacking them. And this ends up being the outward expansion in the legends that are written. So when we look at writing of legends, we want to think now that the Babylonians are writing down current happenings. If we posit that the Babylonians are no more writing down current happenings than Herodotus was, than Homer was, than Plato was, than Snorri was, right? If we want to posit that they're no more writing down current understanding than any other person who is writing down the written oral traditions because they're starting to write as a society, then we can look at this and see that it's possible that these are retellings of stories that have happened before. So we can see where this idea of these distinct language groups even is coming in at this time. Because when we talk about this within because one of the things that I studied in school was archaeology of this area to find out. Because when I found out about the Neanderthals and the sapiens living together in those close quarters in this space, I was like, okay, so I know this is also where we see so much of this first stuff. So what is this coming from? And when we're looking at that, it's often posited that it's a different Indo-European language that we don't know of that is coming down. They have a couple that they've decided that it is, and that there's this fight up and then this fight back down. Now, this genetic evidence is basically showing that the Indo-Europeans who are in the western region of Eurasia are actually being replaced by the Proto-Indo-European group that is in the Levant area, coming out right at the start and the advent of farming, right? It's talking about this shift, and really giving us an understanding of the possibilities of how this can lead further as we go down the road. I find these things interesting because we've talked in here about how I totally believe that it's the start of agriculture that is the cause of violence within society. And an article pops up where they've done a whole study on it. I love seeing these ideas that I'm sitting here going, well, that sounds so correct and that sounds so right. And somebody else thought that too. And they went and they did all this work on it and did this huge study on it. And I'm like, yes, now I can read and enjoy. Now I can see, the proof a lot of times, right? I really enjoy that. So this was really cool to me. And finding this alongside at the same time with this genetic evidence of this replacement culture, or this replacement of not culture, but replacement of DNA, to have a replacement of DNA in that manner and still have the different DNA groups carrying on as well, really gives us this idea that it could be in that kind of war zone, in that new way of war zone, right? Because if you're seeing any distinction within it, again, you have to look deeper. I would say one thing that they're talking about within these, so in certain areas, like the Iberian Peninsula in the south of France, uh, you're seeing people living there before the ice reaches its peak and then surging back north and east as it warms back up. But in Italy, this Gravachian population is completely disappearing and being replaced. He's also show, or they're also showing that beginning 10,000 years ago, the open steppe to dense forest and rich wetland transformation, we're seeing broadly similar lifestyles with genetic distinction between Western Europe and east of the Baltic Sea. And yet, I've seen articles that show Y-DNA from east of the Baltic Sea being the same Y-DNA that we see in the Picts and the same Y-DNA that we see on the Iberian Peninsula. So, again, I don't know. I don't know. I do think that this is really interesting, though. I do think that as we look at this a little bit more, it's going to give us a broader understanding of the way migration is working. And I think that that's really the interesting part to me. Hang on. Okay, so I did put all of these up. I'm finding so much interest in it that like I'm a little bit lost in the like exactly what it's going to mean in the end at this point of time, I think. Hi. So if there's any questions on whether or not, or on the genetics migrating through, on the different things that we were just talking about, let me know. I've got a couple other things that I wanted to go over today. But I wanted to kind of go over a little bit of stuff that relates to this, but not quite. So the background is from the middle article on the this week under 3.8. It's the article about the replacement of genetics that they're looking at between the Gravachian cultures uh, and different cultures within West Eurasia. This is the construction is Gravachian, and it's the same culture that we see the Venus of Brasamthy, which shows a similar kind of possible headdress to what he's wearing. And they have a lot of distinct artifacts that there are first seeing of women that are not of women. Well, there are first goddesses, and the artifacts are generally of females. Uh, but there are our first figurines that show facial features, like an actual facial feature. And the culture itself, they call it the first pan-European. The culture itself is from Spain to Western Russia, but now they're showing a replacement of it. They're also showing, though, within it, as we're looking, there are some cultures that aren't replacing within West Eurasia, but this specific cultural group is, then this specific cultural group is being replaced by cultures coming out of uh, the Czech Republic, and I want to find the other one, and I had it before. I want to say the Levant area, but I know it's more specific than that. Italy. No, because it's not the other article is saying it's not the Italy one. It's saying that's the Italy one that's disappearing and being replaced, coming over. Where is coming over from? The Balkans. People in Italy showing genetic links to the Near East. Again, when we were talking earlier, we're talking about the fact that the glacial maximums are causing like the lake, like the Mediterranean Sea and stuff like that. The coastlines are several meters lower. So that the Italian peninsula is not so much of a peninsula at this point of time, right? And so getting to the Balkans is not really going to be that hard. Okay, so they're stating that the people in Italy are being replaced by a population from the Balkans, and then they're talking about the Magdalenians vanishing and being replaced from Italy. It's all sorts of weird still. They're trying to narrow it down, and they're doing a good job. It's just hard to so in the articles, you have to go through the actual articles, like the actual journal-based articles themselves, to be able to really map it all out. And the articles that give the evidence, like the published articles, don't always, in the way they write it out, doesn't always parse right. This is subsistence genetics. And so trying to parse it between the two can sometimes be. Yeah. Central, Eastern, and Southern. So when we were talking before the other day, we were also talking about the Solutrean culture. They have no genomic data from the Solutreans. Oh, previously. Okay. So the Solutrean data that they're pulling into here, because they have this, yeah. So my understanding of it basically is that we're seeing that again, you're getting certain groups that are being replaced, which makes sense. Um, we've talked before about knowledge of like migration into Scandinavia being two distinct groups. Uh, this could represent not a full replacement, but a that influx because if we're looking at like we know that there is a direct descendant of Cheddar Man living in Britain today. If we're looking at, or in England today, so if we're looking at that, if we're looking at an influx of a culture, and we're looking at that culture slowly becoming a majority, then we're looking at the majority culture, uh, not necessarily fully replacing the prior culture, but just becoming a majority. We are going to see that you're going to see after a while this intermixing of what's left, obviously, because we do see, despite, in this article, we do see that there are spaces where there are direct descendants still left of older graves. So, you know, I would say it sounds to me like the earlier proto farmers and the Malays came out and decided to. And when we look at the changes in the culture, it's the same thing. They talk about that the changes in the culture go from what they distinguish as hunter gatherer cultures to proto farming cultures and early farming cultures. So if this is the case, and at the same point we're getting this influx of people from the space where farming is coming from, and this influx of people with, different not morphologies, physiologies, not physiologies, phenotypes, I guess would be the best way to put it. This incoming group and their culture itself. Well, and at the time, we're seeing that a lot of the culture has similarities, right? Because they thought that it was the same culture initially, anyways, right? So their culture is not replacing, but intermelding with the culture that's there already. This is in effect probably early colonialism, right? This is that very earliest form of taking farming, taking your idea of government, taking your idea of thought process of how to work as a culture, as a civilization, right? And taking it with you into a space that's already occupied. That might be the best way to look at it. Subtle is assimilation. Sorry, I didn't see the replaced or assimilated. Yeah, I would say assimilation would probably be your best way to look at it. There was one, and I'm trying to find, I think what's within the violence article where it was talking about seeing groups that were genetically different living in the same space where you had the incoming genetically the people the incoming genetics in the center of the space of the burial and the prior genetics circling the burial sites, the grave sites. Uh, Again, with the violence, a lot of the uptick of the visualization in burials is going to be coming from actual burials and actually seeing burials stay significant in the same space over generations, right? Like a graveyard. People who live in the same area and therefore are burying in the same area over many, many generations. Uh, and so that is going to give us an uptick in the idea of being able to visualize the violence because it's better preservation, right? You're fine, okay. So mainly the Gravachian culture. Basically, what we're looking at is Central Europe, uh, West Europe at the same time. Like, I'm confused because in parts it's like we don't see a replacement from the Iberian Peninsula, but we know that the Solutreans are the Iberian Peninsula. So are they seeing a replacement from the Solutreans to the Magdalenians or the Magdalenians to the Solutreans, right? Or are they seeing a replacement from the, and in the same paragraphs talking about not seeing a replacement from the Iberian Peninsula. So did you not know where the Solutreans were? Like, I'm not sure what you're doing with that. So I have to kind of parse out what it is I'm going to have to like some of these articles are they named the gravesite and then they named the DNA thing and then they named and they're all in this paragraph and they're not charted and so I'm going to go and mark them out and see if I can figure out how to assess them better to get the different understanding of what they're trying to say. Hey, Fiscography. Have you looked at these articles, the newer articles with the replacement of genetics within the Gravatian cultures that have been coming across the archaeological sites? I know you know DNA way more than I. They are. They are under this week. I have 3/8/23 underneath there. When I'm looking at the violent one, the violence one, the rise of violence one, and this new understanding, what they're looking at within this stuff, I like the different level of they're talking in here about how can you associate it with this, why would you look at it and see this, and how some of them you probably not going to see it like that, you might see something different out of it. They're also looking at healed versus unhealed. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. And absolutely, whenever you have, I mean, you're more than welcome and pleased to come in to talk and say, but uh, it's not a responsibility or anything. And I'm so sorry to hear that you're grieving. When we're looking at this violent evidence coming in, some of this is really, you can see embedded points and stuff like that, which really starts us down that path of really understanding um, that it's actual direct violence and not that cut through of, is it this or is it that? Absolutely. I hope that uh, the source of your grief finds its peace without asking deeper, because uh, public and everything, and that your healing is whole and takes the time that it needs. The article on here that I put on here, the PNAS, you might have a hard time if it won't let you sign in. I think that mine does an auto sign in. Let me know and I'll see if I can find things to get around. But it shows the pictures. For me, this becomes one of those confirmations of understanding. Okay, let me see if I can. I'm going to see if I can upload the PDF itself. I don't think I can. I can though. Yes. Thank you, Subtle. I can though, I think, pop it over into Discord. Which doesn't help everybody. I'll have to figure out how to get it to work on the other one later. But maybe. Oh, I can't. Not on here. I'll pop it into Discord later. I have to be able to do it on my phone. I can't get into it on my computer right now. And I'll see. But I can pull up the pictures and show you guys. Until then. I actually had clicked on the bottom of the article to get to it, the bottom of the original article. And it has some. It might take you somewhere else that would actually work if you need, or if you, let me see if I can. So these are a couple of the skulls. What they're pointing to here is how sharp and clear this is. You can see the break, which shows blunt force trauma. This here is suture marks. These, hold on, I wanted to show you what I was looking at. This is what I really thought was cool. You can see a point embedded in this. This shows you where a point, this is evidence of an embedding of a point, of embedding of a point. I can't get into Discord right now, but the link to it is at the bottom of the, so to get to it, all I did was on this site here. This is an article that I posted. It's the top one, the site, or the full article of this. And then on the bottom, it was this right here. Journal reference, PNAS. And that's this site. My phone, I have to do it on my phone and my computer doesn't. Not really, Alexis, unfortunately. I haven't seen any that are really accurate. This is cool because look at how many points you can see embedded in this. This is a point that's broken off here. And this here is a point here. Because you can see that this is that, it's flint or something here. And then this is, looks like bone. Antler. It's antler. And this is in Sweden. This one is in Tigslav, Sweden. This one is in Germany. This is Trump, England. And okay, they're the same one. So this and this are the same one. This is the base of the skull. That's what that is. So as this arrowhead goes in, you can see how the outer of the skull is like this. This is the interior of the skull. So you can see this kind of like ridging here, right? So this is the interior of the skull and how it broke and fragmented on the interior of the skull. Oh, let me see. I don't think that's it. It's called, hold on, let me flip this so it's not scrolling. It's called Violence Was Widespread in Early Farming. It is the last one. It's SD, the very last one on the site. So that's just a really cool, like, I found the antler or the tine that was really cool. But this having several different, and that looks like that could be a point too. So this is spine, and it usually, the back view of it, you'll see there's like little things that stick off on either side. And it might be like something within the spinal structure, but it doesn't look like it to me. To me, from the picture, it looks like it's the same material as this. It doesn't have the kind of like rough that the bone actually does. So on the picture, it actually looks like it's probably an arrowhead. So that would be a couple of different points in this. Let me see. I don't want to have you guys like have to see while I'm scrolling because it nauseates me. So this is starting 10,000 years ago. A map of northwestern Europe showing archaeological sites with violence-related injuries and Neolithic skeletal remains red, and settlement enclosures, mass fatality sites with evidence for collective violence blue. So you can see, like, here's a blue. There's a few blues here. There's a few blues up into here. There's some red up into here, right? Right? I'm going to flip you guys again. You got to look at my face. Don't want to. Okay, I think that's the images within this site or within this one. But what this is showing really to me is that replacement that we, or not replacement we were talking about, but that evidence of violence starting with that Neolithic thought process of farming going through. And we're seeing at the same point of time in those areas, because this dating on this, make sure I have the exact ones, because she has a specific, she specifies the graves. 8,000 to 4,000 years ago. This is also saying 2,000. So I think 8,000 to 2,000 years ago. Now, again, we're looking at that same time frame, or the end of the time frame. I guess the start of the time frame. So the time frame when you're seeing this replacement happening is starting around the start of the Neolithic, about 10,000 years ago. So these things are both interwoven or interweaving in this. Is this the one where it talks about? No. This interweaving as people are coming out, I think is really, I want to take a look and see if I can find where it's going to indicate which graves are which genetic continuity. So, or which genomes. So I want to take and compare the, I've got to get into and see if I can find the actual charts that chart which DNA is coming from which grave sites, and see if it comes in the same as the violence sites that we're seeing. But with this rise of farming and this rise of city building and this rise of cultural building, right, within this space and this need to own, this need to possess, right, we see this replacement, I feel, in DNA, or at least that's what this, when I say I feel, my feel is that these articles, these understandings are related. That's my feeling. Everything else is absolutely based on fact. You know, I'm pulling up two factual articles. My feeling is that they correlate because we're looking at this timeline where farming is moving. So our earliest evidence is a farming of wheat, a farming of barley, really are coming along the Nile. And it's, again, um, more tending than it is cultivating, right? And then we start to see cultivation within the 12, 14,000 years ago, within the Levant area, Mesopotamian area, right? And that's where we start to see that building. We start to see their written legends coming up of this other group of people that they consider the barbarians in the hills, right? Attacking them and trying to take their grain. So, at the same point of time in the genetics, we're seeing this push out of these areas um, as the glacial maximums are receding and replacing cultures that were there in some areas, not in all areas. But the spaces that we're seeing these replacements of cultures absolutely are looking like they have this high violence action in them. I want to double down on a couple of things. When we look at two groups of people entering into Scandinavia, and we talk about the fact that we have the ancient groups within Eurasia who are dark skinned and light eyed, and we see a dark skinned and light eyed group moving into Scandinavia, and then we see a light skinned and dark eyed group moving into Scandinavia, and this is also, it seems, in different areas of Italy. Um, Sometimes there is conversation about indigeneity within Scandinavia. These are two groups moving in roughly at the same time. The group that is maintaining its indigeneity and is still there is the indigenous group, right? Like, um, absolutely, there are two groups coming from two separate areas into this area as it's freed from the ice, right? Uh, but the indigenous group of people that has maintained its indigenous connection to the land, learning that indigenous connection and bringing it over along the Arctic and the ice regions as it moves into this area, where it meets up with another group moving from the south as it's coming over from the east. Absolutely two, two distinct groups within them, and one group maintains its indigeneity, right? One group is definitely holding on to that indigenous today and is the indigenous group within there, right? I have to remember which link it was. I can't remember it off the top of my head. Hi guys. I have so many different things that I've read. um, Pretty much if I'm out of my game, I'm reading different articles. So absolutely, Fisco. I, I adore you, I have to say, and I am grateful to you because you teach me the things that I don't understand all the time. That's why I was asking if you knew about that because you understand DNA in a way that I do not, and so I'm grateful to you. Thank you very much. I appreciate you sharing your knowledge all the time. Um, and absolutely, I mean, I would please don't put any time or energy into online world shit while you're grieving. Uh, I would love to hear your take later when you have time and spoons and energy on what some of this means, or even just pick your brain on some of it at a later date. But again, please don't take that to mean any responsibility to the online world. Um, but I appreciate you, period. Like you always have some real knowledge laid down. Um, I think really that's just the significance within this is that we're seeing this cultural replacement, and it almost to me seems like it's a replacement of animistic thought process at the same time. And that replacement of animistic thought process at that time, I think also, I mean, like if we see this as, as this, we're seeing really a replacement or an attempt of a replacement of culture, really of a bringing in of an outside governance and of outside way of life and replacing the way of life and governance that's already in there for the first time, then really what we're seeing is the start of a colonial thought process, which we know starts in this area anyways. We know starts coming out with this area anyways. We've often seen that it really traces out through Italy as well. Um, so this is all within that same, like, talking about within these same areas, right? Um, and when we see this, somebody told me recently that colonialism, people have to stop or you start using the word colonize, right? That to colonize is to move into a new area and farm it. And I'm like, that's not the definition. So I want to clarify that the definition of to colonize is to take your group in and replace a prior group's government. Now we have migrated out, we have moved across, we have enveloped within, we have become a part of, we have moved constantly throughout our time as a species. Even the prior species that we come from have constantly moved. Awesome. Thank you, Subtle. And I may have already read it. I'm not pulling it up. Um, and in this constant movement, we haven't been replacing each other. We haven't been, like, taking over thought processes. We have incorporated, right? You'll see a cultural shift in places. You'll see, oh, that new pottery style is really cool. Um, but you won't see, and we've shown this with DNA, you won't see a replacement of people within that. So now we're seeing this replacement of people with an adaptation of people's culture, um, which is also your culture, and a shift of it, right? And again, we're not seeing a full replacement because we are still seeing other groups staying and maintaining. But this is that first colonialism to me. This is that first time where you're seeing, you know, my government, my idea, my way of working, my way of doing, my way of thought is going to supplant your way in your space, right? Um, to me, watching this come about at the same point you're seeing this rise of violence within the archaeological record makes total sense, right? To me, it it solidifies an idea that in that lust for possession of land and that need for possession of land that farming, agriculture, cultivation creates instead of tending, right? In that need, we're seeing that possession need taking over large groups of people. And in that, you're seeing that colonialism starting to replace thought and idea, and that shift from an animistic mixing together, hello, animistic mixing together into this agricultural city government structure thought process comes out. Um, to me, that's just really that significance. To me, that's where we shift from being an understanding of nature that mixes with nature. Like we've talked before in here about, the 31,000-year-old amputation of a foot that's better than we do amputations today. We've talked about, the fact that we see ancient Egypt and even the Neanderthals have these different levels of medicine that we didn't comprehend for a long time. When we're looking at these things, we're seeing groups of people, that animistic knowledge, that very indigenous knowledge, right? That understanding of the biome, that being a part of that space knowledge, right? Gives a knowledge of medicine that you don't find, gives a knowledge of science that you don't find once you disconnect, right? So when you have to rip everything up and replace it to farm, to cultivate, you start that disconnection, right? When you're building walls to keep things separate, and not that walls in themselves are bad, but walls to keep, like your people within and these armies to keep other people's without. Um, when you're creating this extreme individualism, right? Uh, it disconnects from the concert of the biome, the mix of the biome, right? And this is that start of that extreme individual. This is that start of that extreme possession. This is that start of that idea that as long as I can own this land that I stand on, that I have I don't have to worry about anything else. As long as I own this right here, I don't owe to anybody else. I don't have to work within anybody else. I don't have to be a part of anybody else, right? Um, and that comes with that idea that the land that you stand on is a disconnect. That the land that you stand on is empty earth. It comes when no, you're fine, love. Ooh, snow, my favorite. It comes with that, we've talked about this before, that initial understanding that the world that you once thought was all interconnected and intertwined can be plucked and sterilized and replaced, right? That you can grow something outside of its biome, right? That initial understanding, and I say understanding because, that's how we understand the language of it. But this initial belief, I think, would be better because I don't think it's an understanding. I don't think it understands Jack, right? I don't think that it really has an understanding of the world around it. It is this start of this belief system. And it is very hyper individualistic, and it is very hyper based on rank and file, right? Because we see it really, so we see early subsistence farming starting before we see the start of cities. We see the violence starting within that early subsistence farming, and we see the violence starting within the rise of the cities. And in this, we see this idea that you have to have this larger thing to protect you so that you can hold and own this. Now, we had many places where people had the same space that they lived in for hundreds of generations. We had many spaces where people had seasonal houses in every space, right? Like you might have your winter and your summer, and they're all houses, stick built. Maybe they're all caves. Maybe they're, like they're permanent residences. And we have many spaces of permanent residence before this. This is not the idea that we have this shift of impermanent to permanent residence. We've had permanent residence before this. It is the shift of the idea that the land is a part of you and you are a part of the land, to the idea that the land is empty and is to be exploited, that it's a dead thing to exploit, right? That it's not a living, breathing part. I think it's written in. Oh, so what is missing is the link between behavior and how it is written into genetics, if it is. And I think it is pretty much written into genetics as we look at it, right? We see this rise of aggression. We see this rise of possession and jealousy. We see this rise of disconnection from community. Again, we see this rise of individualism. And I want to specify with that, like we have this rise of identity before that, right? Self identity doesn't mean individual, right? Like I can be very unique in my self identity without being individual, right? I am. I'm an extremely unique person through no fault of my own. I wish I wasn't. Um, but that doesn't mean that I don't work for and try for and move within community, right? I don't crave to be individual and different. Um, I acknowledge that it's there and try to utilize it, right? So there's this difference between understanding your own self identity, understanding your own unique experiences, right? And the need to be, we've all seen it, that need to, I'm the most unique thing you'll ever meet, right? Um, I'm different than every guy you've ever known. I'm different than every girl you've ever known. You'll never meet another one like me. We see this all the time. And when we see this, so often, A, it's not real. And so often, B, they have this need to have this individually being individual to set them apart, to set them above, to be their worth, right? That's a great way to put it. Thank you. That's awesome. Village etiquette versus colonization conformity, empathetic versus narcissistic. Absolutely. Because that's what it is. It is making your individuality your entire worth. And instead of understanding that, yes, you have, my individualities are the values that I bring to the community, right? Not being an individual, but being so vocal is a value that I bring into community. Education is a value I bring into community, right? Um, Education doesn't make me valuable. Education makes me gives me the ability to give value to community, right? It's that difference between it's that difference you see in like healers or people like that, or like I lay my hands on you and it's me that heals you, versus the people who are like I put my hands on you and it's the energy of God that heals you, right? Like not like I want to do the biblical thing, but it's that difference of believing that it's your that that your value is to yourself alone, that your value defines yourself alone. Um, Whereas identity often identifies your value to community and how you take part of community. We talked about early like Neanderthals and we see that start of identity within this period of Homo sapiens where Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are so intermixed, right? And in this start of identity, what we see is this identity of, you know, what I do, who I am for the community, right? Like my identity is, and I've talked about like, we see eagle talons and stuff like that really associated. So maybe my identity is that I am one of the eagle hunters. And, we see like ochre, we see a lot of shells, we see, charcoal. So maybe I'm the shell band, right? And I'm an eagle hunter of the shell band, right? So I might wear an eagle claw or specific eagle accoutrements, right? And I might wear specific shell accoutrements, and they identify the part of community that I play, my identity within community, not my individuality within community, right? Yeah. And I know I'm putting a lot into that, just because I think that a lot of times we don't, there is value in having unique skill that you can offer, right? Uh, but when we take that to, again, that narcissistic level, right? That narcissistic level of I'm the only one, or it's all me, or, I'm God because of this, or this is my whole identity. And you should value me more because it's my whole identity. Those are where it becomes problematic. Um, and so when we're looking at these groups, moving in this importance within identity that's already there, we're seeing that this replacement of identity that identifies you as a part of the biome, a part of the land. Oh, thank you. And I've got the PDF downloaded. I just couldn't get it into Discord. Thank you. I appreciate that. So I've got it, but that gives it to everybody else. If you are in the Discord group, it is in there. If you cannot get to the PDF on violence to see it off of the Inwood Ord site, um, I'll see if I can post it a different way. I've got to figure out how to get it up to the site for later. I know I can post like books, so I might be able to do it that way. I can probably turn it into a Google book maybe. But when we are looking at this shift of thought, right, from this idea that we are one, a part of the biome, each serving its function within, and our function within being tending, our function within being, we're given the ability to adapt our adaptations with this need to nurture and this need to be a part of community. These are things that are very innate within us. These are things that are required for us to procreate. A lot of people will be like, well, our need is just to procreate, like locusts across the ground, just procreate. Well, our need has never been to just pump, pump, dump, and walk away. That doesn't ensure procreation. And if your need is to ensure procreation, if your need is to ensure the continuity of your species, you have to understand that as a species, we have 5 life stages from neonate, that means birth, to adult, which means that we have roughly, currently it's 25 years, roughly 20 years in ancient times from birth to fully functioning can be independent. And at no point prior to now can you live all by yourself and meet all your needs, right? So at every point up until now, you've had to have community, not only to raise your children, but to subsist for yourself, right? Um, there's not enough hours in the day for me to feed myself, water myself, because there's different methods of needs of feeding myself, provide for myself shelter, provide for my clothing, and have a baby and make sure it doesn't kill itself while I'm doing all of those things, right? So we've never had an individual existence. We've never been able to exist as individuals. We have always needed community, and we have always needed to nurture our children. Both genders, both sexes have always needed to provide a nurture and care for our children. And very few societies seem to define those roles of nurturing care by gender. Most of those societies seem to define pre Western thought for the most part. There are societies that do, and I'm not saying that there are not, but I am saying that pre-Western thought, very few societies define this role by gender, and they define it by what you're good at, what you're enjoying. If you have a womb, but you're really good at hunting, you're going to be hunting. If you possess a penis, but you really like to cook and you can come up with weird and odd flavors, you're going to be cooking. If you possess a penis, but what you really love is carrying small children around, that's what's going to happen. That's what part you play in the community, because what sings within you is what the community needs from you, right? Communities are created of entirety. Community is benefit when it is entirety, because what sings within me might be to educate children, whereas what sings within somebody else might be to hunt, and I can barely move most days. What sings within somebody else is to create art. What sings within somebody else is to tend a fire. What sings into somebody else is to hold and care for young babies. What sings in all of these different individuals brought together sustains as a whole, right? If we instead force people into a specific path because we view specific paths for specific whatever identities, then we remove the good that they're going to do in that path, the path that they would sing to, right? So if we force a woman with no maternal instinct in her, all she has is a womb, to be the one to care for children, we get children who are abused, right? Whereas if we allow that womb bearing human being to go out and hunt because that's what their passion is, they're going to provide for the children that they don't want to raise, right? They're going to care for the continuity of the community. They might even give birth to those children and never have to raise them. And those children are fully loved and taken care of within the community, right? But they get to do what sings to their heart. So in animistic communities, in pre-conform needed communities, you're seeing this uniqueness within people that is needed, which is valued within the community, because the unique gifts that each of us bring to community give value to the community as a whole, right? They're not an individualistic thing. And our ability to nurture, our way of nurturing, we do what sings, what strengths, right? And when we look at it that way, and we see these communities that are within this animistic state, this is what we're seeing within animistic thought process. When this thought process that not only sees that within the individuals within the community, the human beings within the community, but sees that the animals around you do what sings for them, and the tree does what sings, and the plant grows in the area that it was grown in, that it starts in, that it sings in, and it has all of the different elements of the environment and the biome to keep it that way, to nurture it, right? I was talking to my partner today, and we are looking at the idea of buying land, and we're looking at just buying raw land, and he picked a place, and I'm looking at him like, that's desert and I won't do it. Scrub desert, Eastern Oregon. The problem with scrub desert in Eastern Oregon is that I'm very limited at water, right? Which means that I have to do certain subsistent things that I don't want to do, because instead of, I said, if I go into like, say, the coast of Oregon or Washington, right, the Pacific Northwest coast, I'm going to be in a space that has a heavy water fertile area, right? Which means that I can incorporate indigenous plants that I know from the area back into the biome. And then I don't have to touch them except to come through and talk to them and tend them occasionally. And the harvest from those plants becomes the food that we need, right? The not the harvest, the pruning, the different things that I do to care for and tend for that plant becomes the food that we need, instead of me having to take the whole plant, right? Um, because it's in an environment that it can do that easily on its own. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't ways that I can tend in that environment and specific plants in a desert environment. I'm saying it's more work that I want to put in, because of the fact that even within those even with tending within the indigenous environment, within desert environment, you're limited, and the tending is different. Like, it's a different level. um, but when you're looking at these things, what you're looking at is an indigenous plant within an indigenous biome does not need me to go and weed it every day. It doesn't need me to water it every day. It doesn't need me to go out and hoe and till, right? What it needs me to do is go out and have coffee with it in the morning and maybe pick off a couple of dead leaves, right? What it needs me to do is ensure that, if it's a dry year, maybe it gets a little bit more water, right? It doesn't need me to helicopter parent it, right? It needs me to let it grow on its own if I helicopter tend it, right? I talked about this in the book, and this is one thing that's really big for me. I look at the difference in corn and look at the difference in wheat and barley. And corn and wheat and barley all start at this as the same size of a plant, basically. Like, they all start as a grain plant that's very, very similar in size. Wheat and barley get pulled from their indigenous environment, and in that pull from their indigenous environment, they are transplanted into an environment that everything is stripped. All the nutrients are stripped, and they're fed and watered. They're given water and they're given sunlight, and that's all they're given. Sometimes fertilization comes later, but they're very strictly controlled in their growth, right? And in the way that they're husbanded. Now, both of these plants are husbanded, which means you kind of guide the genetics, right, of a plant. In indigenous husbandry, you might pick all the smaller seeds and eat the smaller seeds and leave the larger seeds to grow for the next generation, so that the next generation is larger. You see some of this within cultivation as well, but what you see is they collect all of it and then they just use the larger ones to replant, right? But with an indigenous tending, because they're only selecting the smaller ones, they're allowing the plant to seed out and to stay in its indigenous area. You're seeing a more nutrient intake, right? For me, the fact that a plant that starts at the same size goes to two completely different sizes is in this. When you take this plant and you've removed all its nutrients, removed all its ways of interconnection with the biome, and you try and force it under your control, it goes from this to this. Whereas you take a plant that you encourage within its environment, that you take the least of it and leave the best of it, that you tend and only take what you need, right? So it falls within its environment. It has all the nutrients in within its environment. Specifically with corn, if you had to transport it from its indigenous environment, you would do things like a Three Sisters method, right? Where there are other nutrients incorporated within that are replacing the indigenous biome that are part of that indigenous biome, right? So you see corn go from something like this to something like this, right? And you absolutely, to my mind, see that because the different outlooks. You see on one side this need to control, this need to regiment, this need to sterilize, this need of conformity. And you see on this other side, this need to blend, this need to sing in concert, this need to work together, this need to be a part of, right? And when you see this need to be a part of and this understanding of this blend, you see this growth. But where you see this rigidity, this controlled, this depletion of nutrients, right? You see that this growth is small because it's stunted, right? Because it doesn't get the nutrients, it doesn't get what it needs out of it. And to me, that's where we see this real difference. To me, that's where this is coming in. When we're looking at farming and we're looking at this start of violence and we're looking at this replacement of culture or of genetics within cultures, right? What we're seeing is this need to control, this need to own, this need to conform, this need to direct and stymie, right? This need replacing this animistic indigenous coexistence. And when, yeah, food forest instead of tract farming, when you see this replacement is when you see this stumble and everything else. Again, we see this violent rise, right? But we also see medicine start to disappear, right? And it doesn't happen right away. We know that there is like we talked about the 31,000-year-old foot amputation in Borneo. When we talked about that, we also talked about the fact that there's like a 72,000-year-old forearm amputation in Eastern Anatolia, right? Um, though, in the rise of violence, did his arm get cut off? Like I'm like, wait a minute, Um, but when we see that, this level of medicine that ends up lost is present. We also see, and we've talked about this, we see trepanation, which is drilling in the hole in the skull, or drilling a hole in the skull in prehistory, which we do see all over the globe. Uh, and when we talk about prehistory, it should be understood that prehistory indicates anything before written language within an area. Written language is defined by Western thought because there's lots of written languages out there that aren't accepted as written languages, either because they're pictographic or because they're runic or because of some difference. But what we define as history changes by region. So prehistory in the Americas is like everything prior to 1492 is considered prehistory in Americas, whereas prehistory in the Middle East ends at like 7,000 BCE, and prehistory in like northeast or northwest Europe ends in like 7, 8, 900, maybe 1,000, when you see Roman Christianity come in and Latinism come in, right? So we see a lot of prehistory surgeries, a lot of prehistory medicine out there. And when we see that prehistory surgery and that prehistory medicine out there, we see that it disappears as this thought starts to take over, right? When we see this rise of violence, we see and this cycle of not cycle, this move of thought and of people coming in and starting again what could very well evidence be the first colonialism thought process, and replacing the governments, replacing the thought processes in those areas. Then we're seeing that replacement of thought process in that area removes the thought processes there of indigenous medicine, of indigenous science that's already there. And again, we've talked a few times in here, science and medicine are indigenous. These things go back prior to us, right? And in every indigenous culture, we see science and medicine. It is not until we get to Western thought taking over and stamping out science and medicine that we start to see any cultures that lack science and medicine. And really, the only cultures that have ever lacked science and medicine are cultures based on the Christian church. Specifically because the Christian church outlawed science and medicine for a long period of time. And I mean anything descendant from Christ himself, Christian church, because I know Catholicism doesn't lump as Christian for some people, but anything Christ descendant. Okay. Yeah, agriculture over healing too. Witch hunt of plant medicine, demonizing and pagan beliefs every day. And that's another thing that we really see. Like we see, I'm sure as we look at that rise in violence, if you correlate the graves with, now, so some of these are mass graves. It's going to be very difficult. But if you were to correlate the graves with different artifacts, you're going to probably see that there's actually target. It seems, especially once we get to the advent of Christianity, there's a specific target towards anybody who deals in plant medicine, anybody who deals in, well, any form of medicine and any form of science. Science because it's questioning God, and medicine because it's replacing God. If God thinks you should die, then you should die. We should not stop him, right? And so when you look at that, you absolutely see that this stamping out of knowledge happens just across all of it. And in that stamping out of knowledge that's happening in this influx of violence that's happening in this replacement culture or replacement of genetics that's happening, again, we're not seeing a full replacement. Uh, we definitely see that Cheddarman has a direct descendant living where, a mile from him, right? But in this replacement of people and everything else moving up and in and through, we're definitely seeing this even in like the cultural icons that they're talking about with the Gravacians. They're talking about there's these slight shifts that they have prior associated with the influx of farming culture that they can now associate with the influx of genetic changes. So it is absolutely something that not only comes from the genetic shift, but it comes from the farming genetic shift, like these people moving in with this farming culture, right? And with those slight changes, you're going to see that you're starting to see lack of knowledge in space, right? Again, because anytime you're replacing that cultivation or that tending knowledge with that cultivation knowledge, anytime you're bringing in the erasure of land, right? Because that's really what that is. It's deciding that the mother isn't there, like the land, the earth isn't alive anymore, right? I've deadened it, I've erased it, right? And then clearing it, right? Robbing it of everything within it. I have dehumanized it, right? And in that, making it not a being anymore, right? I'm also removing the knowledge and the understanding that is there within the cultures that are already there, the animistic knowledge and understanding. So all the scientific knowledge of how to grow those herbs, all the scientific knowledge of where the best food is from, all the scientific knowledge of God, how many plants, right? How many specific plants themselves are we going to see or will we have seen once we look through that DNA, like they're doing DNA of the ground now? When we start looking at that, how many different layers of plants and stuff are we losing because you're not only seeing people coming in and stripping the land, and you're seeing that knowledge loss, but as they're stripping the land, the plants are being removed and no longer able to grow within their biome because while as the indigenous culture, the animistic culture there might have defined that plant as a medicinal plant or a plant that could perform a scientific need. The culture coming in, the Western farming thought process coming in has no understanding of that, right? Power over rather than power through connection. That's very true. And so as you're seeing that shift in and that replacement, this is absolutely, and we've talked about this before, where you're seeing that rise of violence. I can't say that there's no violence before that, right? I can't say we don't see any violence between Neanderthals and humans in the archaeological record, or Neanderthals and sapiens within the archaeological record, right? We see a blending. I can say that we see more of a intermix with the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens than like they're saying between these two cultures living side by side for, from 14,000 to 8,000 years ago that seem to have no genetic intermix, whereas we see lots of genetic intermix with the Neanderthals and us, which would show absolutely a lot of I mean, absolutely can show violent interaction, but if you're living in two caves side by side for 100,000 years, the idea that you're being violent with each other in those two caves, especially if one group is smaller than the other and one group can get replaced easier than the other, like one group has more, like Homo sapiens coming up out, whereas Neanderthals aren't more of them coming back down. You're if we're violent, the Neanderthals would have died out at that point, right? So I really don't see any evidence or need of violence. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be, those quirks that happen, right? To get to the point that the first narcissistic God King happened, somebody had to A, have had the gene for narcissism within them, and B, had to have a problematic or painful childhood, which means they had to have some form of, trauma within their childhood, right? Again, we see that like Sargon and all these early kings are definitely kings that were abandoned in childhood and raised in poverty. So we can see that level of trauma. But to have that abandonment in childhood, to have poverty versus wealth, means that there is something, right? There is something else there, right? And so we're absolutely going to see that there absolutely has to be instances of violence. My thought process with the words, or what I'm trying to make understood, is that if I don't cuss and I I don't cuss, but I pick up other people's words frequently. And I am standing in the middle of an argument where a bunch of people are screaming at cussing and it's starting to make me feel bad. And I'm like, oh, I don't like this, right? Um, then I might start yelling. And in that yelling, I might start cussing. Now, it doesn't mean that I am a violent, cussy person. It doesn't mean that I'm a cussing person. What it does mean is that situationally, I resorted to something that I felt that I had to, right? Um, if somebody is violent towards women, or say there's a dude out there who, the only women he's come across are family members, he hasn't gotten any, he comes across a woman, she's like, no, he gets violent, right? This is an instance of violence that is, again, situational, right? Not saying that it makes it right, again, right? Like, violence against women is never right, but you see where the situation creates the violence, the lack of women available ever, right? And not knowing, this creates the violence, not violent being innate within, right? Um, Now, the person that's defending the woman who may get violent with the man, again, is a situational violence. They're not a violent person, but the situation has created the need for them to defend and therefore be violent. The prior man situation is not a need, but it is a thought within his head. Okay. So when we're looking at things like that, I want it understood that yes, there's probably situational violence before that we are not seeing in the archaeological record. Um, we're not talking about an absolute lack of violence within Homo sapiens. There is some violence within Homo sapiens. But again, when we're looking at comparative numbers, over 2,000 finds between the 30,000 years ago to the start of the Neolithic at 10,000 years ago, you're looking at 77 evidences that could possibly be violence. Whereas, starting at 10,000 years ago and 500 people, you're looking at over 50% of them being violent, right? So if you're looking at this, what you're not seeing is, oh, this is the first time we've ever seen violence. What you're seeing is, holy shit, violence went top notch. Violence is peaking. Do I think narcissism is genetic or learned? I think it's a combination. I think that they've proven that there's a gene that provides a switch for narcissism within the brain. But I also believe that narcissism, like even with that switch, you have to have something to trigger it. Like it has to have something that switches it on. This is my understanding from my own studies. I'm not a psychologist. I studied narcissism because I married narcissist. But and only after the marriage. But it's like a lack in the brain that if trauma happens can switch, right? And I do believe it's genetic, and I believe that when we look at things that we can see as genetic, and the reason that I believe, yeah, abuse kills brain. Well, and abuse can totally like restructure your brain too. I do believe that narcissism is genetic because of narcissistic god kings, and because we've spent the last 10,000 years trying to marry into royalty to maintain safety and security, right? So we've gone through an extended period of time where the only people who have any level of safety and security are the top level people, right? What we consider a royal or in any structure society, the top level, right? But when we look at our earliest kings, I see narcissism and megalomania in our earliest kings because many of our earliest kings have extremely traumatic childhoods, again, abandoned childhoods, poor childhoods, and they have this need to be worshipped, and they have this need to pass blame. And you see this in like all the early writings about kings, right? All of our early documentation about kings. And so to me, God kings, which are earliest kings, are narcissists that or megalomanias who are creating that need, right? They're fulfilling their narcissism and their megalomania. Now, I'm sure that, especially within family lines, there were several that were not. But I do believe that um, many of them were. I believe that anybody who feels the need to control an entire society has something wrong with them. That's just me. I mean, I would run for president. I would absolutely run for president. I would run for president so that I could overturn the government, not so that I could lead the government, so somebody else could lead the government. I've thought about how I could lead a revolution and how I could overturn the government. But even in that, it's like, I'm going to stay in power for 6 months so that you guys can gather everybody together so that we can restructure this. And then somebody else takes power and I step the fuck away, right? It's never the idea of I want to rule a country. It's I need to fix this shit. And that's the only thing I can think of, right? So when we look at people who have a need to fix problems to create a safer society for people, they're not god kings, they're not trying to be worshiped, they're not telling me to give them all their grain and abusing or all my grain and abusing me, right? Whereas most of our earliest kings are doing that, right? It's this hoarding mentality, this possession and this worship thought process. To me, that's narcissism and megalomania. And then we as a society have this need to and then structured and created that way to marry these people, to breed with these people because it's the only way to provide stability for us, right? If the only way that I can have a nice house with running water in it is to marry the king, then I'm going to marry the king, right? If I'm given the opportunity, right? Um, and so I'm going to start breeding children. And like I'm a descendant of Charlemagne. About a quarter of the planet is actually a descendant of Charlemagne. Think roughly half the planet is a descendant of Genghis Khan, right? Like the people who are able to pass on their genetics, my numbers might be a little bit off on this, but the people who are able to pass on their genetics are generally the rulers, generally those who are healthier because they have food. They're not starving, right? And so when we look at that, we absolutely see that almost all of us on the planet have some lineage back to some king or some royalty, right? Um, Obviously, there are groups that that's not going to happen. You would see if we were tracing those groups' genetics, though, that they probably still have links to some form of group that is able to maintain health, right? Unless you're in a group that's extremely cooperative and everybody's maintaining health, which means everybody's genetics are insured on, right? We just might not know who their rulers. And I say rulers like this because I don't think rulers is the correct word. It's just the only way that we would be able to translate it sometimes. Um, so we see that when somebody is able to feed themselves, to not die, to not like they had a burial that came out in Poland a couple of weeks ago or a couple months ago of a little boy who was so riddled with rickets and had basically never seen the sun, right? So and he was wealthy, right? So when you're living in an environment where you're not getting all your physical needs met because animism is gone and the value of life has gone down, then you're marrying to try and meet those needs to ensure that your children survive. So you're marrying into the higher echelons of society. And this to me is where we bred for narcissism as a society. I believe that we bred for narcissism. Well, the dark triad, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. And the dark triad believes that they are the pinnacle of humanity and the rest of us are feeders, right? And this is that ruling class that's maintaining, right? So, absolutely, I believe that we create this, right? Um, but I absolutely believe that it starts here, right? With the God Kings, with this farming structural society. When they take the Anatolian and the Middle Eastern and the Mesopotamian farms from starting, because we see that the earliest not even cultivation, the earliest tending of wheat and barley is along the Nile that I have found at 18,000 years ago. Okay. And this earliest tending is within space. Even within the Nile, though, the idea of cultivation works where it doesn't work anywhere else. And the reason that the cultivation works along the Nile and it doesn't work anywhere else is the yearly flooding along the Nile that replaces nutrients, right? So the soil there is already lacking of nutrients in a lot of ways. The soil itself, right? Like the sand. So if you're planting along the Nile, when it floods the yearly flood, it brings that silt up. It floods its banks. And I think it's like every 7 years it floods its banks. It's really regular, like it's a clock. And in that flooding of the banks, it deposits all those nutrients. And so for the next 7 years, all those nutrients are along the banks of the Nile. And then in the yearly flooding, it gets up to certain levels so it'll actually irrigate the fields, right? And so along the Nile, this works, but this doesn't really work anywhere else. And it only works along the Nile pre-dam. The dam on the Nile destroyed all of that. But with this working along the Nile, you see that this early start of tending and cultivation of wheat and barley happens here. We do see that there are two other areas that we see barley start, one in Europe. I want to say it's a, I want to say it's actually Mesopotamian, like slightly above Mesopotamia area, and then one in West Africa. I can't remember the exact spaces. I just like can picture them in my kind of head. Um, and again, geography is always a challenge. But with the Nile, we see it in these spaces where these things are indigenous, right? We see that it's indigenous to the Mesopotamian area, and we see that it's indigenous along the Nile, and then we see a space in West Africa where these two plant matters are indigenous. And when we see them tended within West Africa, we see this tending gives a great growth of it. When we see tend and slip into cultivation along the Nile, we start to see it tended around 18,000 years ago. I think we start to see early cultivation around 15,000 years ago. And then around uh, 15 to 12,000 years ago, we start to see small subsistence farming within Mesopotamia based on it, which is that transplant, that cultivation. Now, again, this is an indigenous area, but what they're doing within this indigenous area is taking it from its space. So, say it's a grass basically, right? So, say it's growing in a meadow, and this meadow, like maybe it's a meadow near a pond or something like that. So, this meadow is able to maintain it year round, or it's able to grow in this space. And again, if you tend it and only take the smallest and leave the largest to regrow, then you're going to see your meadow develop, right? So they take it from that meadow and they put it in their field, right? And in this taking from the meadow and putting it in this sterile field, we see that start of early farming. And that start of early farming Western agriculture. We start to see, goes on for a couple of thousand years within the, I want to say Mediterranean basin, but that's not it. The Mesopotamian area, right? The Middle East, I think is what we define it as. And in within this area, it starts where we start to see cities building. This is the tepes, Gobekli Tepe and Cajoron Tepe. I can't remember the name on the new one. I've only seen it a couple times. And it's like 2,000 years prior to Gobekli, and Gobekli is at 10,000, right? These are early urban centers almost. They're not living centers, they're gathering centers. By urban, I mean like marketing centers, or, space where you're all gathering together, but nobody's really living there. And then we start to see our first city starting with like Angazal. After this is when we start to see that rise of God kings. Now, we could have had God kings before that. Again, as I was talking earlier, some of these early stories we can absolutely posit are legends from prior times written down, just like we know that the sagas written by Snorri are written like at least 2,000 years after they, or 200 years after they happen, right? We know that many of the myths and legends that we have now are translated from prior stuff that's happened, right? Like many gods and gods actually lived, right? They were just heroes of myth and legend that translate into gods after time goes on. So it's quite possible that the early legends, like the writings of Mesopotamia, like Sargon and stuff like this, are actually writings of prior societies or prior things. Like I mentioned earlier, like we see Plato, Herodotus, all of these people are writing about prior things and prior knowledge. So if this is the advent of writing in this way, and again, we see pictographic writing prior to this, we see hieroglyphs prior to cuneiform. But when we start to see cuneiform and we start to see this verse, what we typicize as writing, it's very possible to posit, or it's very likely that what we're seeing is the telling of stories that couldn't be told in writing before because writing wasn't there before, right? So it's possible that we're looking at things that are happening earlier, like the tale of Sargon can absolutely be what we're calling Angazal today, right? Uh, we don't see in a written record, we don't see in like a pictographic record God kings prior to the advent of writing in this method because of the fact that nobody's marking it down, right? So with this rise of cities, with this rise of this need of control of the land, right? That disconnect and that control of that land. And now we're seeing this genetic flux of these groups of people moving west and replacing certain groups in the west. Again, we're absolutely going to see this as an early colonization. This is an early replacement of culture, an early replacement of government structure. Um, and as we're seeing this moving west and as we're seeing this taking over, this is absolutely looking at this start of where we're at, right? We've talked before, like the phone that you use today comes from the fact that Homo erectus made fire, right? Learned how to control fire. You would not have a phone if Homo erectus had never learned to control fire. We wouldn't have had steel or bronze or any metallurgy if Homo erectus hadn't learned to control fire. We wouldn't have our brain structure if Homo erectus hadn't learned to control fire. We would not have the structure of society that we have on such a vast scale today if we had not had this idea that it was okay to deaden the land. 1 second, please. I'm going to go ahead and take off. I've been here for a couple of hours anyways, but well, give me a minute to finish this up, but I'm going to go ahead. My partner would like me to go with them. They're going to the doctors. They don't do the doctors. So this to me, this all correlates. And we've talked before about this structure of violence rising out of this, right? when this we've talked before about my belief in it. This article just doubles it down. It just confirms that. It just shows that those conversations that we've been having, right? Um, when we're looking at that, and all of this ties in, right? All of this ties in with this progression of violence, this progression of possession, this progression of ownership, this progression of homogeny, this progression of a narrow view of perfection. All of this ties in. And all of this is that structure that we're coming into this understanding is not us anymore. Not that's, I mean, was never us. We're coming into the understanding that was never us. And we're coming into this, like I've said before, this 10,000-year-old experiment that's gone wrong, and we're realizing it and we're trying to change it, right? And it's all within that. Thank you, Fiskio. And same to you, love. And I've got more on the YouTube. Like I keep them all on the YouTube. I'm streaming there now because this often gets popped down. Um, I often try and bring up other Indigenous creators who have more knowledge in certain areas than I do. And if you were up for it when you're ready, I would love to have you come up and talk about DNA and stuff because I know I've watched and you know so much more about it than I do. And again, I mean, no pressure at all, and no like, please, do the things that you need to do right now because that's huge. But you are always welcome to expound and to use this space as a platform because you have so much knowledge. Awesome. I'm not sure. Oh, the article you're talking about. Yes, I will. Absolutely. Have a great one. And I will I'll probably be in a little bit more this week. Again, I'm only doing schedules on Wednesdays, but I might be in a little bit more. I'm working on trying to function a little bit better as I'm pulling through and into the new year. So much love, everybody. And I will see you guys all later. And take care. Be blessed in it. And if you can, take the time to find and connect today to just sit and breathe a bit. That's something I've been trying to do a lot more lately. I mean, I've always done it, but some days I need the reminder. And remember to give yourself grace today, because again, that's always something I need a reminder on. Much love to everybody, and I will see you guys later. Bye on YouTube. I will see you later.